Hi, folks. Robert Lowell Goller here. Thanks for joining us for our weekly chat about local history. This week marks a very important anniversary in the world history as well as our American history, and that is it's the 80th anniversary of VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, and you're going to be hearing a lot about it. You probably already have been hearing a lot about it. May 8th of 1945. And a lot of the imagery we'll see when they talk about it are those really iconic images of Times Square and London. Um, and a lot of times VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, gets mixed up with Victory in Japan, VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. There were two different theaters of war during World War II. Victory in Europe was Germany, essentially, and the victory came in May. Victory in Japan came in August, the official victories. So those images we see get mixed up. People think that VE Day, the images of VJ Day were actually VE Day and vice versa. In both cases, however, there were big celebrations in big cities. And you'll see iconic images in Times Square, particularly. VJ Day, that famous kiss image of the soldier kissing a woman in Times Square. But there were huge crowds in both occasions. On May 8th of 1945, it was announced that the war was over in Europe, and people came out into Times Square. Now, that's the imagery we get when we think about the end of a war. But it was a little bit different in our local communities in small towns across the country, especially for VE Day. And I occasionally go through old newspapers on anniversary dates, like I said, to figure out what might be interesting in an upcoming anniversary. And one of those things was 80 years ago, VE Day. And the Easter Advertiser, it was interesting. They had been anticipating VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, for several weeks. They knew it was coming. And so they had printed in the advertiser, beginning in mid-April, toward mid to late April, printing in the Easter Advertiser, the local newspaper, details about what would happen when the victory in Europe was announced. And the president actually announced it. But what they had said, that there would be a series of notifications. Remember, this was in the days before uh, um, uh, internet, so you couldn't get a notification on the phone or read the news on your phone. So they had there would be radio notification. Lots of people had radios and could listen to radio, but also the sirens were set to go off. They set the sirens off usually for emergencies and air raids, but they set off the sirens with a specific pattern to let you know that that the victory in Europe had occurred. So the sirens went off, and according to that particular pattern, and they made sure they put that pattern in the Easter Advertiser and elsewhere, so people knew that that's what it was. Then finally, church bells rang to signify the VE Day. So first, people could hear it on the radio, the president's speech declaring VE Day, and then sirens, and then finally church bells rang. And what they had indicated is that there were some changes in the rules, and across the country. Uh, they had first said that if the announcement was made before 2 p.m., I believe it was 2 p.m., that they would take the rest of the day would be a civic holiday, and government offices would close and businesses would close. They changed it as they got a couple weeks later, and said that if it occurred during the day, um, the rest of the day would be a civic holiday. But if it occurred closer to the next day, they wanted a full day. So they made sure that it was, if it was before noon, the rest of the day would be a civic holiday. If it was overnight, the next, or later in the day, it would be the next day. So there was actually a protocol for how to celebrate VE Day, depending on when the news hit. And so they published all this information in the advertiser, leading up to the big day. And so it came on May 8th, and the Easter Advertiser published a headline on the front page called "Quiet Victory Day Observance Here," and actually, I think I'm sharing that on the East Aurora, or the Town of Aurora historian page later in the week. Um, and so you see these images of big celebrations in cities, but what actually happened in here in East Aurora was a quiet observance. And they note that the stores did close. Now, mind you, the news came early enough so that the whole day could be celebrated. It came in the morning. Many people listened to the president's speech, and then the rest of the day was a civic holiday. Stores closed. Churches opened for special services, so that was the big deal here in East Aurora as people went to church. There wasn't big celebrations in the streets. That's what you see in the images when you see VE Day. You're going to see that in the news on news clips later this week when they start showing what it was like originally 80 years ago. You're not going to see the church services in small towns like East Aurora. It's more exciting to show the images of thousands of people packed into Times Square and in London as well. And there were huge celebrations in London in particular. There's a great story of Queen Elizabeth and her sister Margaret sneaking out and going to participate in the celebrations without being noticed. So there were huge celebrations in the cities, but not in the towns. So people here went to church. And the stores closed to market. Now VJ Day came in August, and that was a little bit bigger celebration. Now there are a couple reasons for this. One is victory in Europe was important, but we were still at war with Japan, so the war was not over. And so even though a big part of the war ended in May, we still had Japan. So the bigger celebration came when the entire war was declared over, not just part of it. And another reason too is a lot of people living, and this is my interpretation of having read lots of things about this, is that a lot of people lived through World War One. And there were some lessons learned at the end of World War One. That armistice came in November 11th of 1918, and we had several families, a couple families at least here in East Aurora, when the news came of the victory, they thought things were okay, and then they received the news that their loved one had died in service. So we have a couple families here in East Aurora. Actually, there was one that received the news the afternoon of the armistice in World War One. So there was this. Perhaps this thought of people who had lived through the war, the First World War, that they shouldn't celebrate too early the Second World War. And even though the war was ending, you still had your loved ones overseas, and the communication wasn't as good as it might be today. And so people probably just, went to church for good reason rather than celebrating out in the streets, especially with VE Day. My great grandmother was a perfect example. She had two sons, my grandfather included, in World War II, and I can't imagine that she'd be in an overly celebratory mood. She probably celebrated, but not until they came home would she truly celebrate. And I think that might have been what was happening, especially with families who had lived through World War One and had that happen as well. The lag time of finding out how your loved ones were, your sons, your grandsons, that took a while, and I think people were hesitant to celebrate too soon. VJ Day was a little more exciting here in East Aurora from a celebratory standpoint. They actually, same thing, churches opened according to the news, but people actually, it was raining according to the advertiser, but that didn't stop people from going out in the streets, and cars honked their horns. So it was a much bigger celebratory mood here in the village of East Aurora, and you here in cities too, because the war, both theaters of war were finally over, and I think that was the reason. And people honked their horns. It was much more celebratory. Stores closed. Did the same thing for VJ Day in August, but the mood, instead of quietly going to church and praying, people overtly celebrated in the streets. And they had talked in the Easter Advertiser. People did come out and gather in the streets. Now, mind you, not a huge celebration like Times Square, but that would be the pattern of small towns across the country. Is VJ Day was probably more of a celebratory mood than VE Day, even though you'll see in the news coverage celebrations for both. Um, so VE Day was much more solemn, and the headline of the May 10th Easter Advertiser was Quiet Victory Day observance here. Easterorians turned to places of worship, prayed for final victory in Japan. So they were looking to end the next step of the war. Even though they were celebrating the victory in Europe. So when you watch these news clippings this week, when they look back on 80 years ago and they show you the video of things that were happening 80 years ago on VE Day, I thought it'd be neat to talk about what was happening in East Aurora. And thanks to the news reports, we know what was happening and what was not happening on that very important day in our nation's history. Now, in my case, just doing the family history and learning about the folks in my family who served in World War II. It took several months for them to come back after the war. My grandfather came back in November. He was in France. And so I think a lot of families were in that mode of being optimistic, but also cautious when these celebrations were happening. And I just always try to put myself in the shoes of my great grandmother and what she would have been feeling like, during that time. And not necessarily knowing just because the war was over, making sure your loved ones got home. So that's what was happening on VE Day here in East Aurora as we mark the 80th anniversary of that big day in our nation's history. Again, thanks for joining me for our weekly chats about local history. I'm Robert Lowell Goller. I am the town and village historian, but as always, I mention this, these videos and a lot of my research, the books I'm writing are not officially connected to my duties as town and village historian. Thanks for the feedback, especially last week when I was talking about the bricks on Pine Street. I am going to take the show on the road again. I have a couple more ideas. And any ideas you have, as always, pop them in the comments or send me a private message, and I'll try to get back to you as fast as I can. Last week was a little tough. I got quite a bit of great feedback, so just be patient with me. Again, thanks for joining me. Thanks for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time.